And so when the trustee is administering that trust, absolutely vital that they keep good records. They need to keep records of the money that's in the trust, how it's invested, how it's dispersed. There needs to be clear detail on what that trustee has classified as independence versus one of those other permitted expenditures, such as caregiver costs or medical equipment. Yeah, and we're going to talk about compensation a little bit later, so I might just ask you to hold on to that question. I promise you we will come to it a little bit later when I talk about compensation. Any other questions? So the trustee, as you can see, has a fairly extensive responsibility. They have a fiduciary duty to ensure that the oversight and the day-to-day management of that trust fund is managed prudently. So, when we're choosing a trustee, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that it is not an honor. It is a huge undertaking, a huge responsibility, and with that comes great liability as well. So, trustees can be anybody, really, as long as they have capacity and they're of age. So it could be an individual, could be a professional, whether a person like myself, a lawyer, or an accountant, a financial institution, or a trust company, or some combination of both. Choosing a trustee, again, is an art, and it's really important that when you're choosing that trustee, you put your mind to the reality that, again, this trust could be in existence for many years. You might have a son or a daughter with a disability in their early 20s who might have a life into their 70s and 80s. So we're talking about a 50-year plus management of that trust. So we need to be able to think 50 years ahead, because when we're creating this trust today, while you're alive, you may not be here next week. And so it's important that when we're designing this trust, that we're taking steps to accommodate change. Succession planning is vital. So there are a number of criteria that we might look at in choosing a trustee. Obviously, the age of the beneficiary is vital. Is it someone that's 20? Is it someone that's 50? The age of the trustee. Is it reasonable to appoint grandma and grandpa? Maybe not. Maybe you need to appoint a friend, maybe a sister, a brother, maybe a sibling, and possibly a corporate trustee. How many trustees? There's really no magic answer here. It really depends on that family and what the needs are of that family. But we definitely want to have a provision for alternates. What if someone cannot act? Who will then act? What is the method of appointing that individual to act? And so these are really questions that are important also from the planning standpoint, not just from the administration point, ensuring that the trust enables succession, enables planning beyond our lifespan into the time where your son or daughter may be much older and the trust is still necessary. It is absolutely vital in my mind as well that your trustee know and understand your son or daughter and understand their needs. And that is so important. I find that there needs to be a relationship as well. I think as parents, we have a good understanding of what the needs are of our son and daughter, and there's an expectation that our trustee should have a similar understanding. And it's not enough to simply be a trustee, but you also need to understand disability. You need to understand the complexity of the needs of that individual. What is their ambitions? What are their goals? How do we achieve those goals? How do we support those goals?
I was just going to ask in bullet point 3 where it says how many trustees should you have, that can you have more than one person share the role of a trustee at the same time?
Yeah, great question, Angela. So absolutely, we can have multiple trustees acting jointly. We can have single trustees acting alone. We can have alternate trustees. And we can have methods of appointing new trustees if there's a need for, let's say always having 3 trustees, always having 2 trustees. And this is where good planning will take into account some of these eventualities and ensure that, we're accommodating the what if. The what if needs to be planned today because we may not know what's happening 30 years from now. But we need to have a method, a system to actually enable that to actually happen.
So if you were to have more than one trustee, say it's a brother and a sister, sharing that role, when we go back to when you were talking about the discretionary trust and how the trustee has absolute control, would you put in writing or some sort of protocols around decision making should the trustees not agree on?
Yeah. So there's methods within the legislation to permit trustees, if there is, let's say, uncertainty between trustees. So we may want to have, let's say, a method. And that's more common where we have 3 trustees. We might say the majority rules.
Right.
Or we may also have another method. We may have somebody that is appointed as a monitor. And the role of that monitor is simply to oversee the trustees. So this person is not actually a trustee, but actually someone that might be there to sort of observe and ensure that the trustee is acting prudently. And if they're not, we may have that monitor remove that trustee for lack of activity. So there are many mechanisms that could be utilized to provide some controls. And I think you bring up a really good point, Angela, that with that discretionary trust, because we're delegating control to the trustee, we want to have some mechanism to know that we're not going to have a rogue trustee
Right.
out there operating without control. We need to put in some internal controls that will enable that trustee to function optimally. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of those things that we can do a little bit later here. But ensuring that your wishes are carried through to the best of our ability and balancing the need to ensure that the trust continues to be discretionary in the eyes of the ministry, while at the same time giving you some peace of mind knowing that your son or daughter is not going to be completely at the mercy of this individual. And 30 years from now, the trustee may not decide to disperse funds, or they might even more, negatively, they may decide never to disperse funds because they might be that ultimate beneficiary of that trust fund. And so there's an internal conflict.
Right.
So thinking about those issues, being aware of those issues early will assist us in ensuring that that plan is ideal, but also that we don't have a problem where your son or daughter ends up having to come to a lawyer one day to actually get some legal assistance because their trustee is not exercising discretion and not expending dollars out of the trust fund. And, good planning on the trust will help significantly in reducing the problems later on.
There was a question came in online, but I actually think you're probably going to get to it later. So just want to acknowledge that the question came in, what happens to the trust when the beneficiary dies, if there's still funds in it? And you're getting to that later on.
I will get that to that, yes.
Okay, so we will come back to that for sure.
So the other important thing about trustees is, again, and I think this goes without saying, they need to have an understanding of disability benefit, or as you see on the PowerPoint, the EAPDA, which is effectively the disability legislation that outlines what you can and cannot do with a trust. And so your trustee not only has to have those duties of and understanding of trust law, which is, as you can tell, a fairly big undertaking. But now they must also understand disability benefits. And so having somebody that understands that is vital. But I think it's also important that your trustee understand that if they do not have the answers, that they need to go out and get the answers. They need to get the advice. They need to go out and see someone that has expertise to ensure that they're not acting imprudently when they're managing that trust. So the other important element of the trust choosing the choice of trustee is residence of that trust. Where do they live? There are a number of reasons why this is important. Obviously, the practical one. If they live in China and your son or daughter is in Vancouver, is it practical? But more importantly, and this is from a tax standpoint, the residency of the trustee dictates and determines the residence of the trust. So if your trustees are resident in China, the trust will be deemed to be resident in China. And so you'll want to ensure that a majority of your trustees are resident in the province or the jurisdiction where you want that trust to be resident. So a lot of folks will have issues with U.S. residency, for example. Having a trustee that lives in LA, for example, will create a tax issue from a U.S. tax basis. And then obviously the size and complexity of the trust is another factor. I mean, if we have a relatively small trust of a couple of $100,000 to a trust of millions of dollars, there's going to be a need for more complexity and more of an ability to understand the duties of managing that trust. I talked a little bit about conflict already in terms of the appointment of family. And I spent a lot of time in the last webinar about the appointment of family as a co-trustee or as a trustee. I think we all recognize that families with children with disabilities are unique, and that we understand that siblings are a vital component of family, and that, for the most part, those able-bodied children are unique in themselves. They're special. And we know that for many families, it is natural to consider the other sibling as a prospective trustee because we have trust in that individual. I think where the implication of conflict arises, where that sibling is also not only as a trustee, but they're seen potentially as an ultimate beneficiary of the trust fund. That creates a potential for conflict where there may be some deemed incentive not to disperse the trust fund, because if I don't disperse, I'm now going to be the ultimate beneficiary of this trust fund. Now, I know that 99% of the time that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, I see the 1% where it does happen. So, I think it's important to recognize that there may be a conflict, but there are methods to overcome that. And maybe that's by appointing a joint family member or friend or a corporate trustee in addition to the sibling, so that you have some balance between the two. And then somebody brought up the issue of remuneration. Obviously, remuneration of trustees is important. I'm going to talk a little bit about compensation again a little bit later, but there are obviously remuneration issues that are relevant. Whether the remuneration is directly outlined within the trust itself, or whether it's vis-a-vis legislation, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more. And then I think finally to recognize that, with this fiduciary duty of acting as a trustee comes with it great responsibility and the prospect for liability. If a trustee does not act prudently, they could be held liable personally. I think you had a question?
No, we were just saying, did you want a drink of water?
I'm good.
We forgot to offer you that.
No worries.
Sorry.
Thank you.